Hello and welcome to another episode of the 1020 podcast. I'm very excited that today I can introduce you to Frank Furedi. Frank is a sociologist who worked at the University of Kent. He has published over a dozen books, is one of the most quoted sociologists worldwide at the moment. He's a current and regular contributor to intellectual magazines. He writes for Spiked magazine, where I also occasionally have the honor to contribute as well. So he's an all-around intellectual, researcher, academic, and I can highly recommend his work. What I particularly enjoy about Frank's work is he seems like a figure out of a Socratic dialogue. So he has his opinions, he has his positions, but he presents them in a very matter of fact and a very clear, argumentative fashion, which makes it both a pleasure to listen to him and also to read his work. His most recent book is The Road to Ukraine, something we're also going to talk about quite a bit in this conversation. Frank, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Nice talking to you, Ralph.
So I would like to begin maybe with your most recent book. Maybe you could tell us a little bit what motivated you to write it. The war in Ukraine started in February of this year, so you wrote it in a very quickly, a very short amount of time. And I find it one of the most insightful takes on what's currently unfolding in Eastern Europe. So maybe you can tell us a little bit what your motivation was and what kind of the key messages that you tried to bring across.
I think it was an accident that I wrote the book. I never had any intention, but what happened was when the war broke out, I went into Ukraine to see for myself the situation, to understand the developments. And in the course of traveling around, it really hit me that what's happening in the Ukraine is so much the end product of unresolved historical problems from the European past, and that people have not simply understood that these issues are still very salient. And in particular, I felt that although the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia is inexcusable, and I support Ukrainian independence 100%, I also felt that the West was somehow unable to understand and grasp, even contribute to the dynamic that led to this unpleasant and horrible event. And I think in the course of doing that, I felt that there were a number of factors that explain this. I write a lot about what I call historical amnesia, which is the inability of Western societies to remember the lessons of the past, and even a desire to detach themselves from their history and assume that the lessons of history are no longer important. I think this is best captured by the Fukuyama thesis of end of history, which obviously is far from ending, which is now being realized. But what I also felt was really quite important was that in many ways the historical amnesia and the accompanying geopolitical illiteracy that paralleled it was also in many ways linked to a kind of a wider problem, which I describe in the book as the moral disarmament of the West, that somehow the West has given up on its cultural legacy, its historical values, and because it has got no idea where it came from, it kind of has lost its way, which has really come out very, very strikingly in this war on Ukraine.
Do you think that when you describe this historical amnesia, do you think it would be fair to say that this might have been partially self-inflicted, that given particularly the history of the first half of the 20th century, that Europeans not only kind of took the end of history approach as a preview, a prediction, but actually something they wanted to see fulfilled, that they wanted to see themselves detached from the rough and tumble of geopolitics, of history, of all these things, that maybe focus on the more minute details of life. When people mock the European Union, for example, when they discuss the shape of cucumbers or bananas, that actually is not a but a feature, to say we focus on these things, but the storms of the world the lessons of history, something of the past that we no longer want to engage with.
I think that's probably true. There's an impulse to escape from the past and almost to detach yourself entirely from the origins of where you come from. But there's also at the same time something even worse, which is you don't just simply write off the past. What you also do is you condemn it. And therefore what you've got is this, what I call year zero history, where everything that's happening in before the end of the Second World War is seen as being bad. Whereas now, since 1945, we've kind of become these sensitive, enlightened individuals. So you got a kind of flattery, self-flattery, that we're not like people, that lived in ancient Athens or in other parts of our human history, which has got this kind of negative consequence that you simply are living in the present, and this kind of presentism, which accompanies historical amnesia, has this kind of limiting effect on the vision of society, because having lost the connection with the past, you're obviously not in a position to look to the future, and instead you just become imprisoned in the here and now and see that as the best of all possible worlds.
As a sociologist, I mean, there is, we can go back to Christopher Lasch, right, who wrote about narcissism. There are many contemporary books, particularly in combination with social media and how that affects us, kind of a self-centered culture. From your perspective, from your experience and your main field of research, if you would have to describe, the current state of, let's say, civilization in the West and maybe also within the West, when we maybe then later on compare a little bit Eastern Europe and Western Europe, kind of what would your assessment be? Do you think that it's exaggerated, or do you think that what you also just described, this kind of self-centeredness and a certain arrogance towards the past, that there is maybe more truth to it than we would like to believe?
I think that the West has lost belief in itself. The history that it teaches children and people is a history of shame, where everything that has gone on beforehand is shameful, something to be avoided. It's given up on the most crucial of foundational values like courage, solidarity, duty, loyalty, patriotism. All those things are seen as outdated. And instead it's kind of opted for this synthesis of a technocratic outlook that kind of drives it to some extent, that occasionally synthesizes with identity politics, which is really a very identity politics has the effect of fragmenting and isolating people from one another. So Western politics today, public life, Western culture has become exceedingly demoralized and self-consciously avoids using a moral language. And I suppose most important of all, it's also become not just simply cut off from the past, but also from the future. And that's why it's become so risk averse. That's why, if you look at the European Union, all that it does is it regulates. Anything that moves, you regulate it. And you got this precautionary principle in Europe that we can't really do anything that's uncertain, just in case some bad things will happen. Well, that risk aversion basically means that in 2022, we would never even invent aspirin, because the side effects of aspirin are so considerable that they would argue in the European Union that it's just too risky to bring that on the market. So it is a very sad and very self-indulgent Western culture that we live in at the moment. And that's why I think the key issue of our time is the need to challenge that culture in a fairly systematic fashion.
I agree. I mean, I sometimes jokingly say, if coffee would be invented today, it would probably be illegal. And sometimes I still wonder that you can still get alcohol in supermarkets, because again, if alcohol would be invented today, there's probably no chance that it would be accessible for anybody, because as you just mentioned, because of all the risks. If you allow me, because I agree with everything you say, but just something I'm wrestling with myself in recent weeks, because I think what you described so nicely. But do you think that there is still a desire for those values that you described, right? Duty, patriotism, courage. And the reason I'm asking is, I'm so surprised that very often those, particularly in Western Europe, who would describe these values as, proto-fascistic and very dangerous and kind of a long gone time, now at this very moment seem to be the most likely ones, for example, to put a little Ukrainian flag into their social media profiles. So it seems that while they reject those values and ideas in the Western setting, they are very excited about supporting them, in this case, in the Ukrainian case. So it's almost as if finally they have found a place in the world where they accept and approve of these values. And it's almost as if they vicariously live a form of patriotism and nationalism that they cannot have at home in the US, in France, in Germany, but they can have it on behalf of Ukraine. So am I completely off here, or do you think that is kind of a projection or a coping mechanism for a lack of those values?
I don't know. I think what you describe is true. So all these people that says we need open borders and borders are not important, obviously realize that certainly for the Ukrainians, borders are very important. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And certainly, when they see solidarity and loyalty and patriotism in action in the Ukraine, they have to approve that, even though themselves, in terms of their everyday life, are alienated and estranged from that. And I think that to some extent has got to do with the narcissistic way in which they make sense of their predicament. So very often you will find that it's almost as if they can get vicarious courage through Ukraine, which is why so many of these Western leaders go to Kiev to, put their arms around Zelensky's shoulder and take a picture with them, because that way they too kind of can live off that. And in this way, they can do that without necessarily taking those kind of values seriously in their own society. I think that, the way that I see it is that the values of Western culture over the years, the centuries, are so important for life that you cannot just simply get rid of them altogether. You cannot turn, if you reject courage, that's one thing, but you cannot turn cowardice into a virtue. It's very difficult to do that. And you can reject solidarity and duty, but you cannot turn irresponsibility into some kind of a virtue. So there is a kind of what I call moral disarmament that has occurred, which means that occasionally there's a kind of recognition, a kind of the light bulb shines where you say, this is something that is relevant and important. And certainly a lot of ordinary people throughout Europe in particular, also in America, who haven't got a voice, understand the importance of loyalty, of patriotism, in terms of what it means in terms of their own life. But obviously, they don't run museums or cultural institutions or schools or universities.
Do you think what you just described, do you think one of the reasons why in the media echo chamber or what seems to be important, so many things that we discuss, you mentioned identity politics and the questions of gender, and in many ways also the matters of climate and kind of the more radical proposals how to address climate change. Do you think one of the reasons why this seems so omnipresent is because those who create, let's say, the cultural sphere in media, in academia, in entertainment, for them this is so important because they lack any other outlet for what you just described, these values, kind of this idea of a sense of meaning in life. Whereas for the majority of the people, they still have those traditional sources, be it family, be it work, be it patriotism, all these elements. So do you think there's kind of almost a disconnect between an elite that is empty, let's say, of meaning and tries to find new ways and almost forces these new ways on people that are not that empty, let's put it this way. But of course, then also throws them into a status of anxiety because you're then constantly questioning yourself, well, are my values the right ones? Am I on the right path? Because all the people that supposedly know better kind of tell me that what you believe is wrong and here's what you actually should believe.
No, I agree with your description. I think what you have is a kind of elites in Western societies who are always looking for new values, who understand that the value statements that they draw, particularly in America, it's one of those silly habits where you have a value statement. They're completely rhetorical. They're emptied of meaning. And when you look at a value statement in an American or a British university or a company, it's almost like they were written by the same person, because they all, value of safety, of diversity. They are not really values in a philosophical sense, because they have no ethical or moral content to them. So the best example of what you describe is the European Union, which recognizes that it has a legitimacy deficit. It recognizes that what it calls European values, what it sees are European values, are not really anything more than administratively created values. So it's got values. Number one value in Brussels is diversity. But diversity is a description of the many rather than a philosophical or theological or moral value. There's nothing but inherently valuable in the many diversity any more than there is in the few or in homogeneity. And yet they're trying to create a value out of it. And in the desperation that they kind of, the way they're kind of moving forward, they try to attach a value to a whole lot of different things in the hope that they're going to be able to create meaning that can provide connection between them and the rest of the people. And that's not happening and is unlikely to happen, because real values are organic to people's experiences. They're not something that you create in a seminar room or in an office, but they come out of the experiences of a community, particularly a community over centuries as they kind of evolve.
Do you think that this is one reason maybe why in some areas of public life, the push for these, let's call them non-values, is getting like more and more intense? Because as you just described it, since they are not real values, it's kind of trying to, nail jello to a wall. So no matter how many nails you use, it's never going to stick to the wall, but you're probably frantically going to hammer one nail after another into it in the hope that at some point it's going to stick. But since it never sticks, it gets like the push gets harder and harder and harder. And, more extreme, let's put it this way. Not so much violent extreme, but it starts out with diversity as a kind of innocent term. But we now have reached, this idea that it's mandatory. And you see this in all areas as well. And do you think that one cause could be that as you just described it, that we try, or that institutions try to administer values, which are, if we take a deeper look, are not values at all?
Yeah, I think there's this impulse towards, first of all, giving something a value that you hope will be seen as relevant to people's lives. And then after a few hours and a few days, you then tell people that these are values that are not values that you can choose to reject, but you need to accept them, embrace them. So you then create this quasi-dictatorial regime where you have to basically sign up to those values. I think this is most horrific in universities, where you can now go to universities and they can tell you that these are the values that you have to accept when you become a member of our university. Now, one of the things about the university historically is that, except for totalitarian societies, universities don't tell you that this is the values you're going to believe in. They allow you to choose, and they allow you to debate and argue about them. But the idea that you come to Oxford University and you're going to sign up to these values before you can be a part of that university is something that would have been unthinkable not so long ago. And the very fact that they can casually say this indicates how this impulse towards imposing values in a kind of soft, totalitarian way has become almost institutionalized.
Do you think, and I do this myself very often, when we talk about the West, that there are, let's call it, pockets of resistance within the West? And here I'm particularly thinking about Eastern Europe, Poland, for example, but also Hungary is a good example. Do you think that maybe there is not a second pole, but that kind of the dominance of this idea. Some would call it, kind of the modern liberal project, that there is growing resistance to this. On the one hand, within Europe, particularly, partially within the political scene in the US, but I think also a little bit what we saw now with the World Cup. I don't know how close you follow football, but what we saw a little bit with the World Cup in Qatar, right? That there is there are nations or countries or political entities that more openly than they would have dared in the past to reject this what some call the liberal project, whatever then we want to call it. I'm open for for any term there, and maybe that's true within Europe as well. So that the West that there might be a counter movement, a weak one, but one that might be growing.
Yeah, I think that there is. More importantly, I think there's a lot of potential for that. So you can mention East Europe, where I think these sentiments that we're discussing are relatively weak yet. I mean, they are also there, but in a much more feeble form than in other parts of Europe. But even outside of it, I mean, I spend a lot of time in Italy, and where I got a little house in Lombardy, people remind me of Hungarians in terms of their attitude. They really reject a lot of the identity politics and a lot of the attempt to impose this kind of conformism upon their lives. For them, family, community, friendship, beauty, all these things are still very important. And there is a kind of silent group of, I don't want to call it silent majority, but a substantial number of people who think the way that you and I think, but have not found their voice. They haven't been able to find people who represent them and can speak for them. So I think that this is really quite important. That's why I've taken on this job of running this think tank in Brussels, because I think that if you challenge the prevailing conformist consensus and show another way, it's possible to perhaps galvanize other people to stand up and be counted. So I'm not pessimistic. I'm just very frustrated that I live in a world where, in a sense, Western civilization is busy committing slow suicide. At least the elites in Western civilization have given up, and they're the ones that, sort of are more or less betraying all the values that their ancestors and their grandparents and great-grandparents have stood for.
What is, since you mentioned the think tank in Brussels, maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, kind of what your projects are, how you kind of started to join it, and because I would argue, correct me if I'm wrong, you take some personal risk there. I mean, this is I would argue something quite courageous that you're doing. So I'm very glad you do, but this must have been a step that probably was not that easy, or took probably a lot of thought on your part.
Yeah, I mean, we had a big family argument. Some of my family members said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because you're not going to be very popular, and you're going to be attacked and denounced as a far-right fascist or whatever the latest label is." And also, I didn't really need a job because I love what I'm doing. I love my office and writing. That's what I do best, and do my lectures. But I just felt that it was very important to challenge the narrative that the European Union promotes about European values. And it was very important that the culture war is taken to Brussels so that both sides are conducting it. Because at the moment, people that are sympathetic to my outlook or your outlook tend to react all the time. They're always reacting to the latest crazy thing that they hear. And I think that that's a recipe for defeat. We have got to initiate. We have got to basically indicate that these are the important issues. The way we think has got to be taken seriously, because our values are no less European than maybe yours is, probably even more European. And we need to make sure that they are given a voice and aren't put into this intellectual or political quarantine. So, we've only been around doing this for about 6 weeks. And one of the things we're doing is we're basically sort of always projecting an alternative way of making sense of the world, and suggesting that the kind of the values that are dismissed, the kind of more traditional historical values of the West, plus some of the current ones, are actually very, very relevant to people's lives. And I've got academics working there, I've got people working there, producing material, hopefully to both promote alternative policies, but also to shake things up a little bit and give people some hope that there is, that what they secretly think, what they cannot say in public, are actually important, and there are other people in the world who think the same way as they do.
I mean, it seems that particularly the year 2022 might really be a game changer in many ways, because the European, or let's call it the Western European dream and idea that we are moving into this end of history world where, it's accommodation through trade and relationships are getting better. So there's this idea that in the end we enter, let's call it an entirely bourgeois world where material well-being, material comfort will overcome any kind of existential threat or perception of existential threat. And I think both the war in Ukraine, but also, of course, the looming energy crisis in Europe, it seems like a little bit a collision with reality that we are experiencing. So again, in your view, I mean, do you think it would be fair to say, there's a line that the late Donald Rumsfeld once said, right, that weakness is a provocation, that maybe Europe simply deluded itself in a way, not with necessarily bad motives, but kind of the belief that this almost utopian world is about to come on was so strong that of course it also encouraged individuals like Putin or others to become more aggressive in their outlook. And the reason why I'm asking this is because it seems that these two competing theories, in a sense, like one is that Russia felt an existential threat. Kind of the Mersheim argument. But the other one is, I think, what also you described regarding to the kind of Europe's cultural condition, that is anybody really feeling threatened by Europe? Because I think they knew in Russia, kind of what the cultural conditions in Europe are. So I'm still trying to figure out a little bit, what not the truth, but what really was going on. Like there's everybody has an opinion, right? But I still cannot really kind of figure out what I find the most convincing approach to this question.
I think your instincts are right that this is a new world we're moving into because of the confluence of all these different things coming together. And I think that it's very much the case that Europe, the way it's behaved, has been extremely, sad. I mean, Germany is the worst example. I mean, German public life is desultory, and there's a kind of intellectual and political cowardice in Germany that must have encouraged Putin to invade the Ukraine. They thought this is how they behave. The strongest economy in Europe, then we can just walk in there. They're not going to really react. And I think that was an understandable sort of conclusion that he drew. He might have been wrong in the end, but that was really quite important. So you have that on the one hand. You don't have a situation where Western societies are making things up as they go along. There is no strategic clarity about where they're heading. I mean, geopolitics has become a dirty word in the West. And under those circumstances, you create this instability, precisely at a time when you have this decomposition of what they call globalization. Not the internationalization of capital, because that's still going on, but the ideology of globalization that suggested that economics trumps politics and that states are no longer big players because it's international institutions that can deal with the global problems. And that cosmopolitan ideology behind globalization, that's been exposed and has become really, really very weak. And that coincides with the regional breakup of the world economy, where you have more protectionism occurring and where the so-called harmonious economic links have become exposed as potentially quite valorous. And we are back in a situation, I mean, to me, the present moment looks a little bit like it was before the First World War, where nobody knew who would be on what side. If you recall, I mean, Italy is meant to be on the side of Britain and America one day, next day they join somebody else, or with the Germans or the Austrians, and then they join America and Britain. So you got this kind of positioning occurring, which then leads to this massive tragedy, the First World War. So that's the moment we're in at the moment, and that's got opportunities, but it's also very dangerous for that.
But and you mentioned this, kind of what drives me insane in a metaphorical way is that you just mentioned before, right? One of the guiding, if not the guiding value in Brussels is diversity. But at the same time, when you proclaim the importance or the value of diversity, they always seem very surprised, or at least the leadership seems very surprised when they encounter that indeed there is diversity in the world and different countries, different people think differently than we do, even within the European Union. I mean, if you would truly believe in diversity, wouldn't you welcome the fact that, Hungary and Poland take a different approach to societal questions than the Dutch or the Portuguese? If diversity would really matter, wouldn't that be something that you would welcome?
Yeah, I mean, they're very selective about diversity, so they don't particularly love the diversity of ideas, of different intellectual viewpoints. They like their viewpoints, and viewpoints that challenge their viewpoints are immediately pathologized, and basically they kind of ostracized from sort of society. Similarly, the idea, and this is a very crazy idea, because one of the strengths of Europe historically is that there are many nations in Europe with many, many national cultures and values as a result of their uneven and, uneven and contradictory development. And instead of understanding that was a strength of Europe, that people think differently, have different feelings, the European Union wants to homogenize everything, and that's the irony of it. Or the people who promote diversity at the same time want to homogenize certain things, and they don't understand that there's a paradox there, that they kind of fundamentally contradict their proclamation of diversity as an important value.
Do you think often I read that many of these new movements and identity politics and other areas are compared to like neo-Marxists, so kind of very often the comparison to Marxism falls. I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think it might resemble more of, let's say, a secular reformation of a new Puritan movement? Like when you listen to the way they talk, kind of in the way they present their values, that sounds more for me like a movement, let's say, ready to burn witches on a stake than necessarily a movement that talks about the coming revolution. Because whatever one thinks about Marxists or communists, they had a certain openness, let's say, to technology. There was an outlook into almost a Fukuyama-esque way that an end of history is going to come. It's going to be then the communist utopia, and so it was almost progressive in many ways. But the modern progressive movement strikes, and also of course the identity politics movement strikes me almost as the opposite, right? It's backward looking, less industry, no modern agriculture, indigenous populations. Like indigenous ideas should be valued over modern ideas. Healers are better than modern medicine. These kind of ideas, right? Organic farming is that. So I sometimes wonder if this is not more a reformation movement that talks about purifying the soul that has been tainted by modernity than the Marxists that seem much more progressive in many ways.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that they've got nothing in common with Marxism or with communism. And a lot of people, a lot of conservatives are very silly when they describe them as cultural Marxist or communist, or even as left-wing, because there's nothing left-wing about them in terms of the historical way that we understand what left-wing was all about. And I know some people, Andrew Dole, for example, in England, has written a book called The New Puritans, because, yes, they have certain aspects of their lives that resemble that kind of narrow-minded, puritanical outlook. But I'm not sure if that's fair to the Puritans either, because the Puritans were puritanical, but they were quite adventurous. They came to America, living in the middle of nowhere, and they were very pioneering in terms of their kind of orientation to the world. And I think that the problem that you outline is a difficult one. And the reason why it's difficult is because they themselves do not constitute a systematic movement. It's not as if they got a party line, and nor is it that they have a clearly defined ideology. And although you know in advance when you hear of something, how the different members of identity groups or different university professors are going to react to something, you can tell in advance what they're going to say. It's not because they read some ideological text that informs them of that. There's something else in the air. Now, in my second to last book, I call that an ideology without a name. And what I mean by that is that it has not yet coalesced into something that's got a clearly defined ideological form. But what they have is an orientation and an attitude, a kind of self-consciousness, whereby they know they're better, than other people. They're looking for ways of almost kind of authorizing themselves as being somehow culturally distinct and culturally superior to the rest of society. And that's something that is very much captured by the word they use in English, particularly in the United States. The expression they use is, we are raising awareness, that we are aware, you're not, and we are in a position to raise your awareness. And it's all, if you look at their language, they're all euphemistic. And that's the interesting thing about ruling class language in our culture. It's all about using, I don't know, in German it's probably very different, but in English it's things like, that's inappropriate. Now, inappropriate doesn't mean it's good or bad. You avoid taking a stance. Or you say that's problematic. Problematic, what does that mean? It doesn't mean to say that I don't like it, it's bad. It just means you leave up in the air. Or in American and English universities, they say, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this. Now the word uncomfortable doesn't mean, they're not really saying, I think this is really bad. I don't like it. Shut up. Uncomfortable. Where I come from means that the chair I sit in is uncomfortable. I don't like this chair. It doesn't mean that you got this intellectual or psychological resistance to what you're hearing. But the language they use is quite self-consciously euphemistic. And everything about their language and their outlook is almost like a bar of soap that goes right through your hands. That's really how they kind of perceive themselves. But at the same time, when push comes to shove, they can be extremely authoritarian. You mustn't say this. You cannot do that. So I would say it's premature to give them an ideological name because they themselves haven't come to that point. I think it's only a matter of time before that will kind of coalesce together. And it's moving very fast in that direction. And, and they are all relatively new things in historical terms that give them legitimacy. And you mentioned environmentalism. Environmentalism is really an important development because it pretends to give phenomenon a moral quality. There's an expression in English called a green sin. That it is wrong to fly on airplanes. It is wrong not to recycle. It is wrong to eat meat. It is wrong to have too many children. So it's almost like they're developing a biblical set of, kind of what you cannot do. And almost like a new commandment in the way that they're kind of going about it. But that's really still at a stage where that's fusing with all these other things. But they haven't fused yet. They're all running in parallel. But the one thing is that if they hear you and me, their reaction isn't going to be, oh, it's interesting, or I'm not sure. They will react like this, sort of, they will be harsh and firm and not prepared to discuss with us.
Yeah, it will be from now on. I mean, you must be prepared for this. It's going to be the controversial Professor Frank Furedi. I think this is going to be like the new moniker that you're going to get. Everything will be the controversial philosopher, the controversial sociologist, kind of part as you described it about the euphemisms. But maybe just to follow up on this a little bit. Because you said, right, people say, oh, that's inappropriate, or this makes me feel uncomfortable. And I'm sometimes wondering, but isn't that a core element of this, right? That it's no longer about an ideology, a worldview, right? That constructed around whatever it might be, whether it's flawed or not, but it's really about how do I feel about it, right? And we see this in other areas as well, right? It doesn't matter if you are, and again, this is something that makes many people uncomfortable. It's no longer about whether there is factually a biological male or a biological female. It's about, well, you might feel as a male or as a female, and you might feel as something in between, or you might feel one way on a Monday and one day on a Friday. Or another growing debate is, can you be white and feel as black and identify as black? And I'm sure we're going to reach a point where, I'm 40, where I can say I feel as 29. And, somebody will say, well, I mean, if he feels as 29, who are we to tell him otherwise? Isn't that kind of almost a combination of this, what you said before, of a society that only lives in the present, right? Kind of where the highest value is what I am in the here and now. I probably don't have children, so the future is cut off from me. I'm no longer well-read in history or taught in history, so the past is cut off from me. So if the only thing that's left for me is the present tense, well, isn't it then not almost by default that whatever I feel like when I get up in the morning, I ask society to kind of follow me along and indulge me in?
Well, I mean, I think obviously there's this powerful impulse towards privileging psychology and emotionalism as a higher state than people who keep their kind of emotions to themselves, or who use who kind of think that more objective knowledge, sort of is what's relevant, and and that what I call therapy culture is very powerful, in that it encourages sort of what I call the "it's all about me" outlook. It's all about me. It's my narcissistic sentiments that should really prevail. But the interesting thing is, and this is why what we're discussing is actually quite complicated, is because you have two things running in parallel. You have this technocratic, administrative, bureaucratic sort of sensibility which pretends to be politically neutral. It says the expert is always right, follow the evidence, science is got to have the last word. And you saw that with public health in the pandemic. So you got that running in parallel. And at the same time, what you've got is almost like the opposite, where they say that, even mathematics is going to be decolonized, where they say that emotionalism, how you feel, is more important because there are different ways of knowing, different ways of understanding. There is, a woman's form of understanding that's different than a male's form of understanding, and each is equally good. Probably the feminist one is even better, and that's why you have all these, sort of superstitious ideas about indigenous knowledge, and what you got is this kind of highly subjective, sort of emotional, sort of psychological sensibility, running aside the technocratic one. And despite the contradiction between them, the people, sort of it's become synthesized. And you see this most clearly in Silicon Valley, in California, where you have these technocrats, these guys who run big tech companies, who are hard capitalists when it comes to profit making. At the same time, seeing more therapists than you have dinners. They just continually, worried about their mental health. They're worried about, their state of emotion. They love Meghan and Harry, and that synthesis occurs despite the fact that logically we're talking about two very different ways, very different perspectives on life.
I mean, this sometimes reminds me of something we talked about Marx a little bit, but this sometimes reminds me of the Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, in a sense, right? That he made the argument that the more successful the wealth creation through the capitalist system is, the more problematic it might becomes for those who most profit from it, because there is then this, Max Weber said a similar thing, right? This emptiness of meaning. And exactly as you just described, right? Kind of that you have all this fantastic wealth and influence, but apparently there seems to be some emptiness. And it's, I guess it's hard to fill it. And it comes back to also what you said. Isn't it then that I think one of the reasons why also maybe conservatives make the mistake that you cannot have an argument about, let's say, policy when the purpose behind, let's say, is as you described it, an emotional one, right? If something is intended, and that exists on the right side as well. I don't think this is exclusive to the left. But if you follow or believe in something, not so much because you necessarily believe it describes reality, but it gives you meaning, it fills you with something, it gives you a purpose, it's going to be very hard to argue with someone to get away from this, because nobody wants to live a life without meaning. And I think that the problem that I sometimes see is, and you described this as well, we have emptied out, or whether deliberately or by accident, destroyed all the old sources of meaning, right? The family, the nation, the church. In many ways, Nietzsche probably was correct, right? We've emptied all of this out. And now I feel we start to find out how difficult it is to recreate or refill this emptiness in a certain way. I forgot who it was. Somebody once wrote that in some ways the people of Ukraine are probably emotionally healthier than many people in the West. Despite, for whatever afflicts them, they know what they stand for. They know what they are fighting for. And I would not want to trade places with anybody who's currently living and enduring what they have to endure in Ukraine. But I'm not sure if that perspective is entirely wrong, right? That there is a certain comfort in knowing who you are, in knowing what you stand for. And it feels that despite all the fantastic economic wealth we have garnered in the West, or in parts of the West, we have lost that element.
Well, I think you're right about Schumpeter, because he also said that as capitalism develops, it undermines the foundations on which it's built. And he basically saw that the moral foundations that lead to the rise of capitalism suddenly become, eroded and can no longer provide the legitimation that capitalism will need later on. And there is a lot of truth in the fact that for some time now, not always, but most of the time, Western societies have become subject to the crisis of meaning. What does it mean to be what I'm doing now? As far as I can tell, the problem of meaning isn't just simply a question of what nation I belong to or what community I am. I think there was a time when you gained meaning from the fact that you were an engineer or you were a watchmaker or a printer. That job you did is what gave meaning to your experience. And in the world that we live in, we discourage people to gain their meanings from what they achieve. Instead, in our society, what gives them meaning is, an accident of birth or their identity. So people want to be recognized because they're lesbian, or they want to be recognized because they belong to a minority group. And these are not accomplishments that they can take responsibility for. It's a biological or some kind of accident that you are that. But what you should be getting meaning from, amongst other things, is what you achieved. And we cannot really do that anymore, partially because that kind of sensibility is also linked to the fact that you've got a kind of cultural and moral support about the rest of your life. You know where you've come from. You know your origins. You know the road that you began to travel on. You know very clearly the values your parents, grandparents have given you. And in that kind of context, that is something that gives you a kind of stability in life. If you haven't got that, then you end up with what we have today, which is this permanent identity crisis, where you're continually searching for new ways of finding an identity, and you're going around looking for that all the time. Excuse me. A big problem, that. Definitely a very big problem.
I mean, what you just said, this is, I find, particularly when you mentioned kind of the value from being a watchmaker, from being an engineer. I sometimes wonder, I mean, this is in a way also the argument that Adam Smith made, right? And of course that also Karl Marx made. I mean, the big criticism that Marx made about the capitalist system is of course, is the alienation from the fruits of your labor, right? I mean, this is what he criticizes, that you're no longer in command of what you create, and which is an extension, if you want, of your identity, of your soul. So, and precisely what you just said, we have given up on this. So I sometimes wonder, I mean it a little bit facetious, but also sincere. I wonder these days if Marx if he would be reborn and with us right now, if he wouldn't be a conservative in the 21st century.
Well, he would be, and so would Lenin, and so would Gramsci. Because, for example, if you look at their writings on education, they were for very conservative forms of education. I mean, Marx was a big fan of classical education. When Gramsci was in prison, and his son was living in Sardinia, and the son writes to Gramsci that he wants to do engineering, and he wants to, sort of just study science and give up on Latin, Greek. And Gramsci writes back and saying, you have to learn Latin and Greek. Otherwise, without Latin and Greek, you're not going to be able to amount to anything. So I think there is that kind of, they would have been very conservative about family life, about education, certainly. But then so would everybody, because anybody that had real brain cells and was intelligent would have known that these were really quite important. And that's something that we forget, is just how much intellectual life has changed and how it's become estranged from so many of the basic values of previous times. And I think that one of the things that as a sociologist I find quite disturbing is that we become so detached from taking meaning seriously that we don't give young people any meaningful signposts that tell them that they are making a transition from being a child to being an adult. Historically, you got your signposts by getting a driving license, or getting an apprenticeship, or a job for life. I mean, these would be all indications that you weren't a child anymore, or you joined the army, or you got married and you had children. So none of those things are particularly strong anymore. I just read recently that in America, the number of adults living on their own is just rising and rising and rising. And very clearly, they're having no children. They're not living with anybody. They haven't got a close, intimate connection with anybody. And they behave like children. I mean, when I go to America, that's the most extreme example. And I meet guys who are in their middle 30s. They really strike me as biologically mature children, rather than as real men or as real women. There's a kind of self-inflicted infantilization. Partially because there hasn't been that kind of process of giving them those meaningful signs that kind of tells them the distinction between being a child and being an adult.
So do you think the government could play, or the state could play a role in kind of creating the conditions again, kind of to give this guideposts to kind of to create the conditions for, I would say, us to be more grown up again, or to create the conditions for growing up?
In part. I mean, the only thing that I can think of that a government can do, and I'm thinking of Britain where I live, maybe also in Austria, I don't know, is to reintroduce a kind of national service where young men and young women have got to join the army or something like that, so that they learn the importance of responsibility and duty and all these things. That could be one way. I know it sounds weird, but I think that could be really quite important. I'm always impressed when you go to Israel, where people go in the army, and when they leave the army, they become friends for life. The people that used to hang out with, and that becomes an important, almost like a community that you've kind of created. So this is something that I think is really quite important, and that Max Weber wrote about during the First World War. But in the end, I don't think governments can solve the problem, because I think the problem is cultural, and it does require a cultural revolution, where we develop a kind of a situation where we do culturally socialize young people in a different way than we're doing at the moment, and where we basically make relevant those cultural norms that we think are going to support a system of meaning for our lives.
I mean, I think this is a great segue into my final question. Now, if you would recommend, either from an author of the past or a contemporary author, one book or two books to your students and to our listeners, apart from your own, of course, which I recommend to everyone listening to this. They are really particularly over the last one. I highly also I forgot to mention everyone should subscribe to Frank Furedi's Substack. You find it under Frank Furedi's Substack, so it's very easy to find, which I also highly recommend. There is always very interesting and insightful essays, particularly on contemporary issues. So this is something really a must subscription for everybody who's on Substack. But is there anything particular that you would recommend, or that you find in your career that has been a very, very influential piece of work that you would like others to read as well?
Well, I read a lot of things in my life, but the author that I read, I think too late in my life, I wish I had come across him much, much earlier, was Christopher Lasch, because it was almost like accidental that I kind of bumped into him. I don't know how that happened, but I remember reading him and for the first time being just feeling a companionship with the way he was describing things, and because he was dealing with issues that were parallel to my own concerns, but he expressed them with a far greater clarity than I've seen anybody express that. So I always recommend all of his books to everybody. I think they are really, sort of quite important. And I mean, that's the main guide that I would think. Other than that, there are so many interesting authors out there. You could never have too many interesting and important authors, because sometimes it's even good to read books that you don't really agree with, that make you angry, but you kind of learn from. I think that's very important for me. I should also mention the great influence that Hannah Arendt has had on me in terms of her writings. I think particularly her shorter essays, sort of on issues like what is education, what is the past. I mean, all these, her essays have been so good, and she's got, you can't really say that she's left or right, or she's this or that, but she just flies with her ideas. And sometimes, she gets on my nerves because she becomes a little bit too obtuse, but then you realize it was worth reading her because there's something really positive comes out of it.
All right. Well, Professor Frank Furedi, thank you so much for being on with us. I hope we can do this again in the future, and all the greatest of success for your future work. And we make sure to observe it very, very closely.
Pleasure. Nice talking to you.
Thank you.